Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Again, I'm Matt Longshore, Director of Public Utilities. So today, members of our After Action Report team will present their findings on the county's response throughout the Richmond regional water crisis that began January 6th earlier this year. With this report, it's important to note that the scope of this report primarily focuses on the events of that week, but also provides some recommendations from the technical analysis and communications analysis of the report. So to complete this report, an independent review, the county tapped a team of consultants in Dewberry Engineers and Water PIO. Dewberry was tasked with review and analysis of public utilities operational and technical data and to provide any recommendations they saw from that week. Water PIO was tasked with the review and analysis of internal and external communications from the department and from the county, and also to provide any recommendations. So with Dewberry Engineers, we have Dan Vilhauer presenting the operational and technical analysis and findings. Mr. Vilhauer is a vice president at Dewberry Engineers and a professional engineer licensed in the Commonwealth of Virginia with 20 years of experience in water and engineering practices. He received a Bachelor of Science degree in Civil Engineering from the University of Virginia and a Master's of Science in Civil Engineering from Virginia Tech. Dan has worked with Hanover County on numerous water and sewer master planning and infrastructure projects in the last 15 years and has extensive knowledge of the county's water distribution system. With Water PIO, we have Mike McGill presenting his communications analysis and findings. In 2017, Mike founded Water PIO, a public communications firm dedicated to helping water and wastewater utilities of all sizes improve their customer, media, and crisis communications. Water PIO currently works with service providers in more than 20 states. Before starting Water PIO, Mike directed public communications and customer service operations for multiple water utilities for over a decade. He began his career as a news producer with CNN and WUSA TV in Washington, D.C. Mike has completed after-action reports focused on public communications for Austin Water in Austin, Texas, and the city of Asheville, North Carolina, among others. So with that, I will hand the presentation over to Dan Vilhauer at Dewberry.
Thank you, Matt. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Thank you for having me here. So again, I'm Dan Vilhauer with Dewberry Engineers. I'm joined by Mike McGill with Water PIO. So we are going to present the after-action report that we did for the recent Richmond regional water crisis. So I'll start with a brief overview of the agenda. So I'll start with the introduction and purpose of the report. And then I'll follow it with a summary of the timeline of events that occurred over that week for the water crisis. And then I'll follow up with my technical evaluation and recommendations. And then Mike will do the communication evaluation recommendations from there. And then at the end of the presentation, we will open it up for questions. So to start with, as you are aware, so on January 6th of this year, the Richmond water plant had an outage, experienced an outage, and the result of that caused Hanover County to lose public water service in the Mechanicsville area for 24 to 36 hours, and then there was also a 4-day boil water advisory. After that happened, Hanover County hired Dewberry and Water PIO to conduct an after-action report. And as stated earlier, Dewberry was tasked to evaluate the technical components of Hanover County's response, and then Water PIO was tasked to evaluate the communications aspects. So starting with the timeline, so what we wanted to do was first start focusing on the City of Richmond communications related to the outage. So due to the city's miscommunication and delay in communication, that significantly hampered Hanover County's immediate response at the beginning and throughout the water crisis. So starting with the timeline, so starting at 6:30 in the morning on Monday, January 6th, the Richmond Water Treatment Plant had a power outage and noted issues at the water treatment plant. But Hanover County was not notified until about 7.5 hours later, so about 2 p.m. on that same day, that there was an outage. About 45 minutes later, there was a regional call with the city of Richmond, Hanover County, Henrico County, Chesterfield County, where the city informed everyone on the call that the water treatment plant would be back online and operational within the next 4 to 6 hours. Another regional call an hour and a half later at 4:30, the city stated the water treatment plant would be back and operational later that night. However, later on into the evening at 8:30, the city identified that the water treatment plant SCADA system, or the control system, was down, and they sent out a request for all the regional partners with requests for contractors that could come in there and fix that issue. So Hanover County, for their part, called their SCADA contractors and provided a recommendation for a firm to, or contractor to come help with that. Following on to the next morning, there was another request from the city at 4:59 a.m. to send electricians. So Hanover County responded with sending and providing contact information for Hanover County's on-call electrical contractor. At 6 a.m., the city of Richmond requested operational help at the water treatment plant. So numerous county staff, both county administration staff as well as Department of Public Utilities staff, came onto the site at 8 a.m. to assess the situation and provide assistance. And for the next 24 hours, DPU staff were there to assist the city in helping to bring the water treatment plant back online. So this provides a brief overview in the first 2 days of the communication and actions with respect to the city of Richmond. So the following timeline, this starts the timeline related to when Hanover County received word from the city of Richmond that there was an outage. So you can see on the top right, there's a legend color-coded, really indicating the different types of activities. So red indicates county operations, blue indicates public utility actions, green indicates regional events or actions, and then the orange dot indicates the communications from the county. So starting again at 2 p.m., that's when DPU staff or county staff received word that there was an issue at the water treatment plant. So immediately after that, there was an internal conference call with the county. They immediately put into effect the standard operating procedure for the Richmond water outage. And then DPU staff immediately initiated several of those items to react to that. So one thing they did was they ramped up the operation and full capacity of the Doswell water treatment plant, which is the water treatment plant on the north side owned by the county. They reduced the pumping rate from the city to help reduce demand in the city, and then made some other operational modifications to get as much Doswell water throughout the county. At 2:45, as I stated in the earlier slide, there was a regional conference call in which Richmond stated that they were hopeful that the water plant will be back online within the next 4 to 6 hours. But subsequently, as time went on, the city, they circulated a draft boil water advisory to the regional partners. DPU immediately acted and decided to turn off the Richmond feed from the entire water system, and then made modifications so that the Doswell water treatment plant would serve all of the county water system. The boil water notice then went into effect for the city of Richmond at about 4:30 p.m. There was another regional conference call where the city stated that the water plant will be back online operational by the end of that night. So one thing I want to note is the DPU staff, because of their quick actions, they were able to maintain the integrity of the entire Hanover County water system, even though Richmond was under boil water notice. And then later that day, there were various social media posts and press releases, one, to encourage conservation of water, and then two, just making it clear that the Hanover County water was still safe to drink. So moving on to the next day, so Tuesday, January 7th. So as stated in the first slide, Hanover County administration and public utilities staff went on site to further assess the situation at the Richmond water treatment plant, and then provided 24 hours of operational assistance. At 9 a.m., the Joint Information Center was established. And then throughout the morning and really throughout the rest of the crisis, there were various social media posts, live updates, press releases to keep the citizens of Hanover County updated on progress. But as the day went on, the storage available in the Mechanicsville area water storage tanks slowly started depleting because the demand in the system was lower than the supply from the Doswell Water Treatment Plant. And then by early to mid-afternoon, it was evident that the water storage tanks were not going to be able to maintain their level. Before they dropped all the way low, DPU staff made a decision to isolate the Mechanicsville area completely from the rest of the water system. And then that the Mechanicsville area or east of I-95 was put on a boil water advisory. But the remainder of the water system, so what was termed as west of I-95, was still in service, still operational. So that includes areas of Ashland, Elmont, Doswell. Later that afternoon, or pretty subsequently after that, Hanover County set up 2 bottled water distribution sites to allow for citizens to get water if needed. And then again, continued the communication, social media updates, and whatnot to keep citizens informed. Moving on to Wednesday, the water system continued to operate as before. Hanover County has set up another set of bottled water distribution sites, and then also set up 2 potable water truck stations for most of the day. There were additional regional updates, and at that point, the city of Richmond informed Hanover County that the water plant was slowly ramping online, and that in the afternoon, water would start flowing from the city. So about 4 p.m. that day, DPU staff started seeing gravity flow at the Lockwood Water Pump Station, which is the pump station that pumps from the city of Richmond. DPU staff went out there to manually slowly turn up the feed there, just to make sure that the system was being repressurized properly without any issues. Once DPU staff was comfortable with the fact that they could put it in operation, the rest of that night through the next morning, the Mechanicsville zone was repressurized. So by 8 a.m. the next day, so on that Thursday, Mechanicsville had pressure, but still under a boil water advisory. So DPU staff focused on getting the system back into compliance and removing the boil water advisory. So they implemented about a 6-hour water main flushing program where they went through all the main transmission mains in Mechanicsville, flushed until they were able to measure a high enough chlorine residual, and then proceeded to take the first round of bacteriological samples to ensure the water was safe to drink. Again, that same day, there was also another set of bottled water and potable water truck stations open to allow for citizens to have water. And there was a news release that the boil water advisory would be expected to be lifted by Saturday. So moving on into Friday, another thing that the Department of Public Utilities staff did is they constantly communicated with the Virginia Department of Health, and that allowed them to reduce the sample duration between the first set of samples and the second set of samples from 24 hours to 16 hours. So at 9 a.m. they were able to take the second set of bacteriological samples. Later that afternoon, they got the good news of the first set of samples passing. And then there was another update to inform the citizens that we were still planning on putting the water system back fully online without the boil water advisory on Saturday. On Saturday, got the good news that the second set had passed at 10:30 a.m., notified VDH, were notified that the boiled water advisories were lifted for Richmond and Henrico as well. And then at 11:30 a.m., the Virginia Department of Health allowed Hanover County to lift the boil water advisory, and the system was fully back online. So moving on to the technical evaluation. So I'm going to briefly go over the overview of what I'm going to talk about. So just to orient everybody, I'm going to do a brief overview of the existing water system. I'm going to talk about how the water system was operated prior to the water outage, and then I'll go through the steps the DPU took in more detail during the water outage. I'll follow that up with a review of the steps they took, and then I'll provide high-level technical recommendations for short-term and also long-term actions related to technical approach. So starting with the water system overview, so the Hanover suburban water system serves about 25,000 residential, commercial, and public customers within parts of the suburban service area. The three sources of water for the system include the city of Richmond through the Lockwood Booster Station, and that comprises the largest feed, so that's 20 million gallons per day. There is a Doswell Water Treatment Plant, which I mentioned earlier, that has a capacity of 4 million gallons per day, and that's located on the northern end of the county and pulls from the North Anna River. And then there's also a small connection at Route 33 or Mountain Road from Hanover County, but that is typically not used. Just for comparison purposes, the demand in 2024 within the system was about 8.5 million gallons per day on average, and with a maximum daily demand of about 14 million gallons per day. So if you compare that to the total 24 million gallon per day capacity, it's fairly out of capacity to handle the current demand. And then the system is divided into four pressure zones, and just to orient you to these. So generally the Lockwood or Mechanicsville zone, the majority of the water comes from City of Richmond. The majority of the Doswell zone, that water comes from Doswell. And then the two zones in the middle, Ashland and Elmont, usually it's a blend of water, both either from Richmond or from Doswell. And this is a map. You probably can't see every single detail, but really the intent is just to orient you to the system. So the color code signifies the different zones. So the cyan or the blue zone, that's the Mechanicsville zone. That's the zone that lost water. And that's served mostly by the city of Richmond on the southern side of that. The green zone and the north side, that's the Doswell zone, and that's served by the county Doswell Water Treatment Plant pulling off the North Anna River. And then the pink or magenta, and then the orange and yellow zones, that's the Ashland and the Elmont zones. And again, they get blended water from either the city of Richmond or Doswell, depending on how the system's operated at the time. And you can sort of see them, but there's a number of squares with T's and P's in there. Those are really the pumping and tank facilities that help move the water back and forth from the supply points to the point of demand. And also just to give you an overview of the water storage and pumping capacity. So this is a summary of the total storage in the system. So Hanover County has 15.7 million gallons of storage available to the system. 8.9 million gallons per that comes through an agreement with the city of Richmond. So that storage is actually in the city of Richmond, but Hanover County has access to it and has credit for it. So the remainder of that is in the Hanover County system. And then just to give you an idea of what that storage is relative to what the recommendations are. So based on the maximum day from 2024, the recommended storage is about 5 to 7.5 million gallons. So to put in perspective, the storage that Hanover County has is 2 to 3 times more than the minimum recommended storage. So moving on to how the water system was being operated prior to the outage. So the system was operated in typical winter mode. So as some of you may know, during the winter, the water demands are less, mainly because of irrigation. We also don't have industries like Kings Dominion online fully. So that calls for modified operation. So the average demand, just for comparison, was about 6.5 million gallons per day. And at the time, or before the outage, about 2/3 of that was being supplied by Richmond through Lockwood, and then about 1/3 of that was being supplied by the Doswell Water Treatment Plant. The water storage operation prior to the outage, the tanks were operated about 50% full to maintain water quality. So doing an analysis based on the data available, that resulted in a total storage of about 11.7 million gallons with taking the credit from Richmond, and then about 2.8 million gallons just storage in Hanover County. So again, based on the demand during that time, the recommended maximum storage is about 3.85 million gallons. So again, still well above what was the minimum recommended storage capacity. And the reason I highlight that is, I've gotten questions of, well, why don't you just run your tanks at 100% full to give you as much storage as possible to respond to whatever happens? And there's a good reason for that. You always have to balance, as a good water operator, water age and storage. So if the water sits in the pipes for too long, it results in the deterioration of water quality. And I pasted an excerpt from the Virginia Department of Health Waterworks regulations, which governs the operation and design of water systems in Virginia. And that says that excessive storage capacity shall be avoided to prevent water quality deterioration. So based on that, Hanover County had to just balance the storage versus maintaining water quality, which they've done a good job of that. All right, so moving on to what happened during the outage. So this generally follows the timeline, but just more focused on the technical part. So I divided into 3 separate phases. So the first phase was loss of Richmond supply. So at 2 p.m. on January 6th, Hanover County was informed that the Richmond water plant had an outage, and they immediately went to their published protocol, which has been in place for nearly 20 years. And so some of the things they did is they fully ramped up the Doswell water treatment plant to full capacity. They initially reduced the pumping rate of Lockwood from Richmond just to help Richmond out, but then once they realized that there was going to be a longer outage, they cut it off, which that maintained the integrity of the entire Hanover County water system. And then they turned around, they made some modifications to other facilities to feed all the pressure zones from the Doswell water treatment plant. They did test a emergency connection with Henrico County on Route 1 to see if they could get some supplemental supply. Based on interviews with operations staff, at the time they saw inadequate pressure, so they decided it'd be a better idea just to keep it closed to ensure the integrity of the water system. So that was in the protocol, but then they also took additional actions which were above and beyond, just based on their operators' knowledge, experience, and really understanding the system. So they reduced the operation of their pumping stations to lower pressure, and what that did, I think a lot of people in Mechanicsville probably saw this, there was lower pressure, but you still had service. It reduced the actual demand, so it prolonged the time that the water was available. And then they very methodically, slowly used available storage in the system to slowly supplement the supply deficit. So those actions actually, in my opinion, probably prolonged the availability of water in Mechanicsville for at least 6 to 12 hours. So definitely a very quick thinking, proactive actions on DPU's part. So phase 2, so that's when the Mechanicsville zone did lose water. So eventually, because the supply was less than the demand, the available storage ran out around 2 p.m. And then that's where Hanover County took quick measures to isolate the Ashland zone from the Mechanicsville zone. So again, the rest of the system, Ashland, Doswell, Elmont still maintained service. The Mechanicsville area lost pressure. So again, in the updates, there was a lot of conversations or discussions of East 95 versus West 95, and that's really what happened is DPU staff isolated the two systems and allowed West 95 to maintain service. They issued a boil water advisory for Mechanicsville, but again, maintained service for the rest of the system for the duration of the event. So that was phase 2. So phase 2 went on until DPU started getting flow back from the city of Richmond by gravity. So about 4 p.m. on that Wednesday, January 8th. And so DPU staff wanted to make sure there weren't any other issues associated with the repressurizing system. So that can happen where if you repressurize a system too fast, you can actually cause water main breaks and other issues and actually extend the duration. So they actually went out there manually to their facilities and slowly ramped up the pumping rate and monitored the pressure and activity of the rest of the system over a 4-hour period. Once they were satisfied that the system could return to automatic operation, they put it in auto, and then that system, the mechanical system, repressurized overnight. And then DPU operations staff next morning proactively started a 6-hour flushing program to ensure that all the water is flushed out. There was a good chlorine residual in there, so that when they took those bacteriological tests, they passed the first time. And that was really key to ensuring that the system was able to put online and having the boil water advisory eliminated as soon as possible. So again, once they did that, they worked closely with VDH to get that boil water advisory lifted, and the mechanical pressure zone was back in operation. So some takeaways of DPU's response and action. So DPU staff, once they were informed of the outage, performed really well. They were definitely hampered by the slow communication and miscommunication by the city, especially in the first day. But once they got that information, they followed the protocol line by line, and then also based on their operational expertise, they had some added value to really extend service in Mechanicsville, and then also bring back the system as quickly as possible. It also really important to note that because of their quick thinking actions, they were able to maintain water service to 2/3 of the system throughout the duration of the entire outage. That's something that the city of Richmond couldn't say, or Henrico, so both of them had to issue boil water notices for their entire system. So that's a huge win for Hanover County. And so, in general, the response was top notch, and I was definitely impressed by not only interviewing staff, but also looking at all the data and operational logs that they shared with me. I do have some recommendations for after review. So technically, so at the end of the day, the reason that the Mechanicsville zone ran out of water was because we couldn't keep up with the demand. So the supply from the Doswell Water Treatment Plant couldn't keep up with the demand in the entire system. So some short-term recommendations. I said earlier, Hanover County looked at potentially looking at supplemental water from Henrico County, or Route 1, found that to not be feasible at the time. I do think it makes sense to do some short-term studies to evaluate how we can best use that direct connection that's already there. So in the future, if there is an outage, getting some supplemental water from Henrico could extend the ability for Hanover County to serve the citizens. So pretty low-cost options. Long-term recommendations, again, that's not going to be a long-term option, is to complete a comprehensive study to evaluate additional long-term water supply sources. As you can see, the balance of the water is currently coming from the city of Richmond. So to do that would be prudent and advisable. And then also, if you have your water supply sources in different parts of the county, it's also important to get the supply to where it's needed. So I would also recommend doing a transmission study to make sure that you could get the water from any supply point to any demand point within the system. That would just increase redundancy. So that's the conclusion of the technical evaluation portion. I'll turn it over to Mike to talk about the communications part.
Thank you for having me today. We're very honored to be called in to take care of this communications piece of report. Water PIO, my firm was founded in 2017. We're based outside of Wilmington, North Carolina, but we work with utilities, engineering firms, industry organizations, state agencies to improve customer immediate and crisis communications. We have a special kind of focus on crisis comms because of my work and some members of our team's work in the news media. I've been in water since 2007, and as was mentioned by Matt, I was a news producer for a decade. We are certified crisis communicators. We use the National Incident Management System and the Incident Command Systems for crises with our water clients across the country. We were brought in post-Texas freeze with Austin Water because they lost water for 1 million people during that crisis. And in Asheville before Hurricane Helene, they had a water crisis where they lost water for 6 days. They used our recommendations and the technical recommendations from the committee we were on to fix those problems so that they lost water for 53 days after Hurricane Helene, and they got through that event. We were first hired by Hanover County Public Utilities to help with lead and copper rule communications because that was kind of a flashpoint in our industry last year. So we had a good working relationship when they brought us on board to do this report. A little bit about our process. It's designed to get candor and open opinion of the participants. And we use the process that we use for the after-action reviews in Austin and in Asheville. The interviews were conducted with leadership, staff, local news media, everybody who could provide input to help us give you a full report for an evaluation of your performance and recommendations of where you can improve, because you can always improve during after a crisis. We normally use interviews, but because we had the compressed time frame, we use questionnaires. So everyone got the same set of questions. They were asked about what they did, what their role was, what they did during the crisis, and how they felt about the response. When we had unique answers, we followed up with unique questions for the participants. With the news media, we interviewed a few members of news media to get their evaluation on how well the county did its job. And so in exchange for us providing some inside information, those interviews were held off the record, but we are open to interviews after the report is released. That's our agreement with the press. The process was in place to enable the participants to be protected. No direct quotes were used in our report. We had paraphrase used. When comments mirrored each other, we kind of grouped them together so you couldn't pull out one person when they came up with their comments. We believe the process worked. I think you'll see in the report we had an open and honest review of the work that was done, of the challenges that you faced, how you came through, and the recommendations for the future, including the input from the press. So the table set the situation, the incident challenges, they were referred to earlier. During the first 24 to 36 hours of this event, the poor communications from the city of Richmond hampered the response, especially on the communication side. In that timeline that Dan showed, it laid out how the communications were dealt with when it came to the county, what was said, and what led to some communications that maybe the county would not have put out if they had known the full story of what was going on. The event was downplayed. You had that initial communication of voluntary restrictions, and we'll talk about that later on. And then, of course, immediately switch gears to a more serious event within 24 hours. You lose credibility in those situations. And in this case, it was not the fault of county staff when they put out the communications because of what they were receiving from the city of Richmond. Fortunately, because Hanover County was involved in the operations, the operational response, if you will, the county's comm staff was able to get up to speed and correct the communications that were put out in that first chaotic 24 hours. The process for communications, I'll say this, we did some interviews, we gathered some information about how the city handled its communications during the event. So we had a good view in our report of what took place, and their process for communications did not help you in getting out timely information, correct information to your residents throughout the event. Fortunately, because your staff was there at the plant working on the problem, they were able to relay through your strong internal communications process what was going on so your county comm staff could do their jobs well. As the event moved forward, because of that situation, there wasn't a lot of trust between your county staff and what you were receiving from the city during the event. So your staff operated on its own, and in this case, it worked well. That's not the ideal situation. You'd obviously like to have every jurisdiction working together, but in your case, the county staff had to come through and kind of go beyond that. This report doesn't provide a comprehensive look at Richmond's communications, but like I said, we had some initial conversations. In my world, when this happened and you saw what was taking place, there were a lot of conversations in the water world about what was going on. So there were already kind of information being kind of relayed about what was taking place before we were even brought on board. Conversations, interviews, and questionnaires revealed a lot of common themes and issues that we'll talk about here. Again, Richmond failed to properly inform comms throughout the event. But you had those strong internal communications. Matt on down, it really was impressive, including the county administrator, to get that information throughout the comm staff, throughout your customer service staff, so you could properly help out your residents during the situation. Your customer service staff was able to extend their hours, have proper messaging to give to anybody who was calling on the phone to find out what was going on. It was very helpful. There was some initial blowback on social media about what was taking place, but because your communications were so strong, it turned. In crisis communications, one way we know how a comms team is performing is if that audience online kind of changes its reaction to everything. You know, we always talk about 5 to 10% of people online are always angry, and in a crisis, they kind of take over and kind of overrun the information that's out there. Because your staff did their jobs well, those always angry people were kind of isolated. There were people taking the side of the county on social media, and that's always a sign of strong communications during the event. There were some minor to moderate gaps that we'll address in the recommendations, but we believe they're very easy to address by the staff you have and by the process that will be in place. Number one recommendation, I'll get into that, is the creation of a water utility-specific crisis communications plan. And we'll talk about why you didn't necessarily have one in place for this event. So our overview, I kind of gave away the story a little bit. You have a solid team of pros in place. You have the comms role clearly defined in the process, the crisis response. They're clearly respected. You saw that in the internal communications. No one was kept out. No one was put in an arm's length or left out of key decisions. And we see that all over the country on crisis communications with water utilities. There's kind of an operational response that takes place. We'll solve the problem and then we'll let you know what to say. And that's always a mistake that we see in crisis comms. Here, the communications team, customer service, everybody was in the mix for the process. Everybody was sharing key information. So you had a lot of accuracy and speed with your communications once they got going after that initial 24 hours or so. You didn't use the county's crisis communications plan because there was a belief it was for fire, EMS, and police, that maybe a water crisis didn't rise to that level, so that's where you'll see our main recommendation. But despite this lack of a plan, your staff acted as if they were under a plan. Everything that I would have in a crisis communications plan, the staff did and did very well without having that structure in place. The mistakes, I put it in quotes because really they were hiccups. They were minor. They didn't hamper your response. They didn't hurt your credibility. They used Facebook Live early in the process. There were some hiccups around the first use of that and pushing out information afterwards. But once that was ironed out, you got on a regular, consistent flow of information during the crisis, and that's always a sign of a good effort. There was a little bit of a delay in an internal joint information center being created, and that can easily be addressed. The biggest gap we saw was some complaints within the news media when we interviewed them, that the process was one-way, not two-way, because of the use of Facebook Live as a kind of de facto press conference. They didn't complain about the information that was relayed, however. It was clear, it was comprehensive, but they wanted more of an opportunity to interact with staff. And I'll get into why staff operated that way. There was no concerted effort to keep the media at arm's length or anything like that. It was just a matter of process that can be addressed moving forward. The crisis communications plan, like I said, is our number one recommendation. And what's in that plan? Well, your team operated at a high level, but you don't have a specific plan for water situations. And so that is where you will have that gap filled with a water crisis specific plan. You can get the county up to speed fast. It helps with speed and accuracy, and it guards against misinformation and disinformation. Again, they operated so well without a plan that the misinformation online was reduced pretty quickly. However, with a plan in place, you have that structure and you just go. You have quality control, you have an approval process already set, you have templated information that they can use to increase that speed. That was one comment that we received from several people with the development of a plan. You'll have templates in place where you can put in the information and go even faster. It will also prevent those gaps, like we said, with the news media, with elected officials, critical customers. We heard comments about pulling in community organizations and having them help out. That would all be in the plan. School systems, there was a few comments about including the school system to help out with communications. That can all be part of this communications plan. And of course, your customers. The steady flow of needed information throughout a crisis is essential, and that's what a plan will do. But again, their work mirrored as if they had a plan in place. So the creation of a plan shouldn't take that long, and actually they can take the lessons learned from this incident and craft that plan and make it strong right off the bat. The internal comms, this was a particular strength, and this was, unfortunately a necessity. Because of the poor communications from the city, there was a gap. and fortunately, you were able to fill it because you had teams on site relaying information through the appropriate processes, through the county administrator, through the customer service staff, through the comms team. They were able to get out the information quickly and avoid that operational approach that I talked about. So it wasn't like Hanover County's team was on site at the plant and not saying anything to county staff about what was going on. They knew what was going on through your process, and that helped avoid the mistakes that the city was making during the event. So we found it was strong across all levels. The fact an org chart is in place, you hear the term silos and guarding information from crossing over into departments. Everybody was involved, and that helped you with your strong external communications. And so in my past, I was a communications director that was just given a customer service department one time for 250,000 people. It's kind of weird how it shakes out in water sometimes. So we were always mindful of the fact of where customer service staffs might not be fully integrated into a response. Here they were. They were able to quickly expand their hours for their call center. Their staff was, I wouldn't say scripted, but they had all the information they needed to interact with the residents. And they had an escalation process. So obviously you're going to get some calls from people who are concerned and are not necessarily believing everything they're hearing, especially when you had the issue going on with the city of Richmond and the news that was hitting at the time. And that can overlap, saying you must be having the same problems. You must have, a lot of the issues that were thrown out there. In this case, customer service staff was able to have all that information, have an escalation process, and that enabled you with what we call frontline success. If your customer service staff is communicating well with your customers, that takes a big, that helps you. That's a big advantage for you to keep misinformation and disinformation growing. The external communications, again, we felt that the leadership, Tom's staff, and other employees was excellent. That helped you with your external communications, with some outreach gaps that I talked about. The information was clear and accurate at all times. You did not have to go back and change your information because of inaccuracy. The first information that you put out about voluntary restrictions, yes, that ended up being wrong and had to move, but that was based on the information you were getting. So the error that was made was, you don't want garbage in, garbage out is a phrase we use a lot in communications. That was not a full assessment of the situation, and therefore you put out those communications. Your social media use was excellent. Like I said, if we see people online taking the side of the entity, if you will, versus someone who's always screaming and yelling, that's a sign that your communications are working well online with social media, and that's what we saw. The Facebook Live use, it was the first time use, so you had those kind of minor issues at the start, but once they got rolling, that information was there for people to get and have a rundown of the situation from the county's point of view, directly from the county. As we mentioned, the press felt, well, if this is going to be a press conference, we should be there, and we'll address that in a second. The website was excellent. You had clear, comprehensive information, easy to get, easy to find, clear, easy to use format. You clicked on it, you saw the latest update. You also could pull up the previous updates. Some websites you have like a 30-page scroll to get information throughout the entire event. That didn't happen here. You had a nice design and flow to your website. I mentioned customer service. And again, I mentioned this before. The news media had issues with access, but they didn't have issues with the information. It was clear and comprehensive. The press releases covered a lot of ground. And when they had follow-up questions, staff was very responsive and helped put together follow-up interviews based on the information they were seeing. Once again, we talk about the need for increased outreach to the community, non-governmental organizations, faith-based organizations. That can all be built into a plan where you get contacts, you develop relationships, so that when you have an emergency, you can put out that information. And those people serve as force multipliers for the information that you need to put out, so you can cover more ground. You have a natural path with your customers, but you can always use additional help during a crisis. The news media, I mentioned this before. Let's talk about it in a little bit more detail. Again, the information was full. They had issues with engagement. They pushed out information with limited engagement. But again, comm staff was complimented on that information and their willingness to help and follow up. The Facebook Lives did become de facto press conferences, and that's something to think about moving forward. All the press wanted invites, even if they couldn't get there, they wanted to know that they were welcome there and they could get there, and here was the time that you could be there. The explanation we got from staff was from multiple people, made sense. In the past, you haven't had a lot of coverage for maybe non-emergency events. You haven't had media come to you because of distance and time, especially in a situation like this. There's a thought, well, if we handle it this way, we're making it easier for the press to cover this story, not harder, because here's the information, you can get it without coming to us. That was the main kind of thought behind the process. So we didn't find any kind of willingness to say, no, we want to keep the press away at all. So that kind of, I guess you could say, debate between press and comm staff, that can easily be ironed out now. That's a gap that we've found. The press also differed on the schedule of communications. We found the regular rhythm that the comms team got into to push out information to staff and elected officials, community leaders, customers. It was a 2-a-day schedule. Some press felt that was great. Other press said, well, we would have liked the information a little bit earlier for our newscasts later in the day. So maybe a 3 o'clock or 3:30 release versus a 4:30 release. Again, these are matters that can be addressed in a comms plan. But again, some of the press we interviewed didn't have an issue, some did. Secondary findings, unfortunately, I've been in a lot of water crises where we have tried to issue voluntary restrictions. It is a best practice in our industry, so there was no error made in coming up with voluntary restrictions in the situation. Unfortunately, what we find in crisis moments, especially ones where it's kind of blowing up at the time, that people increase their water use. They figure, well, if I'm going to lose my water, I might as well load up. So you saw increased demand, increased water uses with the issuance of voluntary restrictions. It's unfortunate, but that is just the way it works. And we found this everywhere we've been. So one of our recommendations is you come down to a decision of how are we doing on water use. If you think you might need to go to mandatory restrictions, and that is a proper move to make, then that's what you should issue. Some will say that you can issue voluntary restrictions with an admonition that, if you use too much water, we could lose fire protection, which is the top message to use to get people to not use their water. It's kind of it doesn't quite work because a voluntary restriction is a softer message, but if you use water, you could lose fire protection is a harder message. So we prefer as a best practice, if you believe you might have an issue with water, you should go to mandatory restrictions. The water distribution communications, this was an issue where they got out notice a couple, I think it was 3.5 hours before the stations were set up around that time. That's a lot of notice. That's proper notice to give. Unfortunately, in this case, because people immediately went to the scenes, there was an issue with a water truck getting to the site for distribution of water. It's just one of those things that happens in a crisis sometimes. I wouldn't say it was a mistake for staff to put out that information when they did, because they said it would be open at X time. Perhaps for the future, we just make sure logistically that the water is closer to being on site or on site before it's announced. But that's just one of those things that happens sometimes. So we do a lot of crisis work. And this is a recommendation we're going to make with a little bit of a caveat. We were told top to bottom throughout everybody we interviewed that your current process where county administrator, the incident commander, if you will, is your lead spokesperson of the event. And this has served you well for years. In our crisis response, it's a best practice to have someone else as your lead spokesperson for an event like this other than the incident commander. It just gives them a bit more, it frees them up to focus a little bit more on the response than have to deal with the messaging. And In this situation, you were secondary. It really wasn't your fault what was going on. You were dealing with the response. But in a situation where perhaps it's more something that you are personally responsible for, that could be an issue where dealing with the press at the same time you're trying to solve the problem could be a bit too much for an incident commander. That's why under the National Incident Management System, it's not done that way. It's a recommendation because, again, top to bottom, everybody we spoke with said that this process has worked and worked well for years. Two other things, greater use of Code Red and Hanover Alert. We developed a system up in outside Washington, D.C. for use of Code Red for all major water emergencies. We were first to do it across the country. It can work and work well. That's factored into this crisis communications plan that I talked about. So you can have greater coordination and greater use for events. For something like this, if you can mark an area, you had a clear boundary of who was having water supply issues and boil water advisory and who wasn't, you could use that and mark those lines with your communications during the crisis. It also helps with renters and non-customers. That's the toughest piece of this. We saw Austin Water in Austin, Texas had 50% of their community as renters. That was difficult for them to get information into those hands, if you will. Where Hanover Alert Code Red could help out is with those people specifically. And training for staff. It's a day or two of training to make sure everybody knows how to use the system, because you never know when a crisis may occur. In Asheville, we dealt with the fact that it happened on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, so some people were simply not available, so you have to have that built in. And then, as I mentioned earlier, use of community organizations, faith-based organizations, school systems, anybody who might be willing to help you out during the crisis to get out messaging that helps protect public health. They should be enlisted in the crisis communications plan, and a relationship developed where basically they're helping you get out the information, push out the information. And if they have questions, obviously they have someone they can directly talk to as they conduct that work. And that ends my presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to all three gentlemen for your presentations and your comments. I'll now open the floor for board member questions and comments. And then after that, we will hear from our county administrator. First, board members who wish to ask questions. Mr. Hudson. Questions or comments? Either or, sir.
I don't particularly have any questions, but I did enjoy the comprehensive report. First, I just want to, as a supervisor, want to thank the citizens. I don't believe I do try to advocate for my district, but I don't think I've ever heard the word Mechanicsville so many times in my life. So maybe you elevated us in some way, even though it was a kind of a terrible time. But thank the citizens of the Mechanicsville district for how they looked after one another, and we had neighbors helping neighbors, dropping water to each other, checking in on each other, and that really meant a lot. As your supervisor, I did field between text messages, phone calls, and emails, hundreds of responses, and I just want to say thank you to all of our county staff and how hard that they worked and communicated, well, really with all of us, but to me specifically, as my area probably was the most affected because it was just 100% of us were without water. So that's really just what I want to say, that even in a time of crisis, that our citizens really shined. And I'm grateful to be a part of this community. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Hudson. Anyone else on the board? Mr. Stoneman.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have a question. Yeah, you brought up is one of the options to is to increase the storage or test the connection from Henrico. So, yeah. So if we're having a crisis, it's coming from Richmond, would that not affect them as well? I mean, is that a viable option?
So in this situation, it probably wouldn't have helped. But in a lot of situations, you have a long water transmission main that doesn't impact Henrico at all, coming directly from the city of Richmond. So if you have a major outage in that water transmission main, or it's isolated in a certain part, Henrico may not be affected. And in that case, if only Hanover County is affected, that could be a short-term viable option. So, and that'd be part of the evaluation, look at those scenarios and where it would make sense and where it wouldn't, so.
So I got a couple of questions. So for the Doswell plant, once we received information that we were going to have a crisis, would it have been a good idea to increase water flow from the Doswell plant to the storage tanks, or to try to fill that area up so that we had a little more water? So would that be something we'd want to look at?
Correct, yeah, so that's actually what DPU staff did once
Okay.
they were notified. So I think they were notified about 2 p.m. I think shortly after that, within half an hour, they ramped up the Doswell water treatment plant. If they had gotten notice at 6:30 a.m. When the plant actually went out, they would have had a lot more time to start filling up the rest of those tanks, so that would have made a difference.
So, and one other question, what options would you, I mean, I guess we'll get into this later, but as far as to increase storage, maybe in through remote locations so that we can access, I mean, would that make more sense rather than so have 50% storage in more areas?
So, yeah, I mean, so if you looked at the graphs or the figures that we showed, Hanover County has a lot of storage relative to what it should have, and I think if you have too much of it, you're just going to have issues with water age and water quality. I think my recommendation would be to have a redundancy in water supply sources, and then making sure that if you have one water source out, that you can transfer that water to any location that's impacted. And so a lot of the county system does have a lot of transmission redundancy. So the fact that DPU staff was able to turn the water around from Doswell all the way to Mechanicsville, while that water is still available, it definitely is a testament to the years and decades of planning that Hanover County has done to make the system resilient. It's really just a matter of there wasn't enough supply to keep up with that demand for that long of a time.
Sure. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Davis?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, I think there's clearly three things that we might need to look at. First of all, as regional policymakers in a situation like this, we are a recipient, but we pay for these resources. And I think we immediately need to work with our colleagues in the region to establish some protocols where folks like Director Longshore and our staff are allowed to be on site on a regular basis in a critical supply facility such as Richmond. I believe we're going to have to start talking and having substantive conversations in-house here with the policymakers in Hanover about some additional supply or redundancy measures. And then lastly, while we do have this agreement with Richmond, and it is concerning with the communication and the lack of communication, but we figured that out now. We know what happened, and we can put some measures in place. I would suggest that while we're still in this agreement at this time, we need to have some talks with our colleagues in the region and maybe establish a board or a commission. We have a number of regional boards and commissions that work very, very well. We do this with the airport. We do it with the Central Virginia Transportation Authority. We know how to do it. I would encourage my colleagues to support the creation of a regional water board, not necessarily an authority for the daily operations of that Richmond plant, but a body that convenes on a regular basis in order to have better communication and keep up with some of the official information that comes into that plant, EPA audits and those types of things. It would be important, and we already have a successful establishment for that type of foundational board, and I would encourage folks to not only support it here, but speak with their colleagues and their friends in other areas. And I would ask Mr. Badesky and the county attorney to start working on some framework to present to the board if my colleagues would so kindly agree. Thank you, sir.
Supervisor Pritchard?
Mr. Davis, you might have just answered my question. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I 1,000% support what you just said. We need regional oversight, and I think it's a shame this is how we had to find it out, but having never dealt with it before, we know now. My question is, where do we start? who initiates such an authority and where does that begin? But it's a question.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you, sir. My belief would be to leverage the relationships that we have within the region now. Ask the county administrator, start talking to the county administrator in the other localities. And for those of us who serve in regional capacities, which a number of us do on this board, reach out to our colleagues in the other regions, the jurisdictions, specifically within the MSA, and talk about this. Would be my suggestion to start that through the conversations with the established relationships that we already have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. Any other board members? I do have a couple questions. I think this is more on the technical side, possibly for the engineer, sir. Just out of curiosity, and I know the demand's different for different times of year, as you mentioned in your presentation. The storage that we have in Hanover, approximately how long did that last before it ran out?
Well, so the Richmond water supply was cut off at around 4 p.m. on Monday, and so with the demand at the time, and only Doswell, I believe it was about a day that it lasted, yes.
That was my theory, sir, because I reside very close to the Creighton Road water tower. I think the report showed us about 1 million gallon capacity there. And my water went out about 4 o'clock that Tuesday, and it was back on about the same time on Wednesday. So I think my water was out about 23 to 24 hours. So I think your report is accurate on those points. The next question I have, and I know Mr. Stoneman touched on this already, you had mentioned the Henrico water supply possible option. I thought Henrico was served by the water treatment plant. Do they have another source?
They do. So they have their own water treatment plant off Three Trot Road in the west end.
Okay.
That pulls off the James River as well. And so, and again, every situation is different. And so I'll caveat it with saying that this, what I'm talking about is a short-term emergency evaluation to see if during an event in which Henrico or Hanover County doesn't get water from from City of Richmond, and Henrico does have a available water supply, put in practice a standard operating procedure to get some sort of supplemental supply from either that Route 33 connection or the Route 1 connection. It's sort of a short-term emergency procedure just to see if they could, because if you had a little bit of additional supplemental water supply even for another day, maybe we could have extended Mechanicsville for another day, and by the time Richmond came back, maybe it would have been okay. But in this instance, it didn't work because Henrico County was put under a boil water advisory anyways, so it wouldn't have made a difference, I don't think. But there are instances where Henrico could not be affected, but Hanover could, and that could be a good redundant supply.
Thank you, sir. Thanks again for your presentations. That's all the questions I have for you. I do have a few comments. I do agree with Vice Chair Davis and Supervisor Pritchard on exploring the possibility of adding a board. We have more regional boards than I thought. CTAC is one of them. Anybody willing to serve on urban transportation, please let me know. That's one of them. We do have the airport, and I think it would be wise to have something like this in the future. And of course, we would need some willing citizens who would be willing to serve on that, and I think we have some right now. I do think, even though this was a very difficult time, that there were some positives from this experience. It could have been a lot worse, and it could have been a lot longer. My water was out about 24 hours. That's not very long compared to 35 years that we've been on the system. And I think when we have a tough time like this, it is important to recognize the 35 years that it did work very well for our citizens and our community. And I think that's a positive. I do think there was a lot of good community teamwork. We saw Wegmans. We saw Walmart, who donated bottled water to our sites, and we thank those community partners for their donations. We saw, I'll speak to myself. At Cold Harbor Elementary, our Hanover Fire and EMS team stepped up strong, had great organization at the water distribution site. They had people on the site as the vehicles were rolling into the parking lot. We were opening the doors and the water was going in a very timely and efficient manner. And I think the citizens that showed up that day appreciated that. They saw that it was organized and it was efficient. At one point, there was one gentleman working the forklift, moving the water around, and there were different people doing different things. Very well managed by Hanover Fire and EMS, and I thank our fire chief for that. Couple comments also on the use of the media. I do think there is a possibility that we could work with our media partners just a little better. I think we utilize Facebook Live very well, and I think that was very beneficial. I'd just like to point out that we have a lot of citizens who are not routinely active on Facebook. I did one of my own studies about 2 years ago, and I found that at least 10% of the citizens in the Cold Harbor District are actively on Facebook. Maybe 20% have accounts. Others have accounts that have been dormant, they don't use them. So I would say about 70% of our citizens in our area really don't get a lot of information from Facebook, and I think our media partners could really benefit our community because someone who may not be on Facebook, they may be watching Channel 6 or Channel 10 or Channel 8 or Channel 11 or whatever they may watch. One other point I would like to bring up, one of the concerns I had is, for those who are not on social media, how do they get the information that this water crisis is going on or is getting ready to affect them? And one thing I found out was we have a program that's available on our Hanover County website, Hanover Alert. And before I turn this over to our county administrator, I would ask Mr. County Administrator if you could address for our citizens Hanover Alert system, or if we have someone on our team in the room, he can do that. And finally, Mr. Badesky, this was a very challenging time. It was very challenging. This is very stressful for a lot of citizens. And your job as it is has a lot of responsibility and a lot of demands on it. And I would like to compliment you in general for the work that you did in getting the information through our media team out into the public. That concludes my comments, and I'll turn this over to Mr. Badesky.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the board, and thanks for the kind words, but this was truly a team effort to respond to our community's needs on an incident that was not necessarily of our making on January 6th. I do want to thank both consultants for the work and diligence you put into this in short order. We promised our residents a 30-day after action report, and you helped us deliver on that, so thank you very much. We know that this was a major lift, as it was for us to address what we needed to do on behalf of our residents. This process isn't unusual. When we go through an issue, we always do after action reports so we can try to identify ways to continuously improve how we support our organization and the business we conduct on behalf of our citizens. This particular day was an interesting day. It was a day not too dissimilar to actually yesterday. We were actually closed. The county was closed due to a storm on Monday, January 6th. A number of us were actually working in the building, even though we were closed to the public that day. And at 2 o'clock, we got a call, which we thought was a call to plan on the following Tuesday's snow impacts, and had learned of the issues that had occurred in the city. As you now are aware, issues that had occurred a little over 7 hours earlier that day. As soon as we were made aware of those issues, we engaged our public utility staff and our regional partners that certainly included the city, but Henrico and Chesterfield as well. And I am really proud of the response of the regional public utilities teams. I think working together, our staff focused on what the initial priority was, which was getting the plant back and operational. That had to be our top priority, or we would have never been able to come out of the issue in the first place. And collectively, our utility staff, working together with the city, were able to do so by late Tuesday night, restoring water to our residents on Wednesday. That time of notification gap that we had, and I believe the questions were asked earlier, we probably could have stored more water. We could have responded to our residents earlier. We could have stood water support up for our residents even earlier. I can assure you that in conversations that we've had with the mayor and follow-up and their staff, they understand the concern that we have on behalf of our residents of that never happening again. And as it was said earlier, this hadn't happened since we begun this relationship in 1994, but one time was one time too many for our residents. And so as we move forward, working with the city, as you know, you saw in the reports earlier that 4/5 of our water right now, we are reliant through our agreements with the city of Richmond. That is not going to go away overnight. However, our focus on resilience for our residents and long-term water supply planning is undergoing as we speak. This will continue to be a priority for us as we move forward. This can be solved not alone by Hanover, and we've begun conversations with our regional partners in Hanover County. There is opportunities potentially for capacity and working with them with their Cobbs Creek Reservoir project. There's the interconnect projects that you had heard about today that we can look to bolster our system and build resilience. And we certainly need to assure that the operation in the city of Richmond is operating as professionally as it possibly can to assure our residents the reliability that they deserve and that we pay for as customers of that system. And so in our conversations with our regional partners, as this board has directed my office to do so, we're committed to working with the region on a regional solution. The city has been a long-term partner and will continue to be a partner, but as we move forward, we have to, based on this incident, make sure that our residents' needs are always first. And those solutions and may not always be our primary responsibility of the city as our primary water provider. And we will be looking at those alternatives as we move forward and look forward to working with our partners in Henrico, Chesterfield, and the city moving forward. There were a few recommendations made here today. Our communications strategy as it relates to water emergencies, ironically, was actually underway while this incident took place. And so we had already begun adding that water component to our emergency communications plan, and we'll operationalize that here in the weeks and months to come as well. I am proud of the work that our communications department did. We were responding very quickly with sometimes very limited information. And based on the facts we were able to get by having staff embedded at the plant and with our communications team, we got information out as quickly as we possibly could. While we did rely on the Facebook Live, we also did record those in other formats and made them available on our website, so that not always was Facebook the primary resource. Folks could have accessed those videos through our website and other social media platforms as well. But it's not, want to be clear, we did not turn down a single request from the media. And in fact, we were grateful for the media's support in helping get the word out. We also had a number of residents in Hanover County that were not able to go pick up water at our distribution facilities, and to be able to establish delivery for some of the shut-in residents. And we had board members delivering cases of waters to residents' homes and other volunteers throughout our community. Mr. Hudson, you said it earlier, the resilience of our residents was pretty amazing throughout this process. And so while it will be our job moving forward to avoid this from potential reoccurrence, we couldn't do this without our residents. And so I believe not only working together, but being able to use that force multiplier that was mentioned earlier of reaching out to, whether it be our faith communities or our not-for-profit communities, to make sure that everybody in our community is as informed as possible, will be critical as we move forward. So while today is the 30-day after-action report that really focused on Hanover's response from 2 o'clock on Monday the 6th until water restoration that Saturday at 11:30, there is a substantial amount of work yet to be done. And as you are aware, there's a regional report that the city's working on. That report will more specifically detail what actually caused the issues at 6:30 that morning. And we have offered and welcomed the opportunity to engage all of the information we've provided here today through our consultants, through our research, to the city's folks that are working on that report. It's critical we find out those issues and understand them fully and avoid that reoccurrence. But I do believe that it's going to take a substantial regional effort to assure long-term success, substantial investment to assure long-term success, and we're going to need to do it together. And so I appreciate the board's support in that direction. Thank all the staff that was involved, the residents that stepped up. We had volunteers through our CERT teams and MRMC volunteers and others. We could not have done this without you. And so while we hope we're not in this situation again, very proud of the response that had occurred that time, and look forward to working with our regional partners as we move forward to assure that this does not reoccur again. Thank you, Mr. Chair.